Chapter 1. The Veiled Widow. The grief of Evelyn Thorne was a performance, and she was a master thespian. For 3 months, the town of Dust Devil Flats had watched her play the part of the broken widow, and not a soul suspected it was a role. They saw her glide through the dusty street, a silent figure in a stark black dress, her face veiled as much by a practiced sorrow as by the thin, dark lace. They saw her buy her meager provisions at the general store, her voice a near whisper, her eyes, when they were visible at all, holding the distant, haunted look of a woman whose world had ended. Her world had ended, that much was true. It had ended with the single, deafening crack of a rifle shot that had echoed from the direction of their small homestead's well. It had ended as she'd held her husband, Thomas, in her arms, his life's blood soaking into the thirsty dust, his last choked words a name that was not his killer's, but a warning. The official story, the one Sheriff Brody had reluctantly settled on, was that Thomas Thorne had been the victim of a botched raid by the Red Dog Gang, a ruthless crew of outlaws known to be in the territory. The evidence was circumstantial but convincing: 2 sets of shod hoof prints, a dropped shell casing from a Winchester rifle favored by the gang, and the testimony of Bartholomew Black Bart Corbin. Corbin was the undisputed king of Dust Devil Flats. He owned the saloon, the bank, the livery, and, it was said, the sheriff himself. He was a man whose ambition was as vast and unforgiving as the desert that surrounded them. Corbin had told the sheriff that he had been riding out to the Thorne homestead to make another offer on their land and offer Thomas, and Evie had repeatedly refused when he'd seen 2 riders fleeing the scene. He'd found Thomas's body. It was a tragic, but sadly common, frontier story. Evie played her part to perfection. She wept at the funeral. She accepted the townsfolk's clumsy condolences with a quiet, tragic grace. And she endured the visits from Corbin, who, under the guise of neighborly concern, continued to pressure her to sell the homestead. "It's too much for a woman alone, Evelyn," he would say, his voice a low, sympathetic purr that made her skin crawl. "Let me take this burden from you." Her land was the key. The small, stubborn patch of earth she and Thomas had worked until their hands bled. It was not particularly good for grazing, and the creek that ran through it was little more than a trickle for most of the year. But 3 months before his death, Thomas had been digging a new well and had struck not water, but a thin, unmistakable vein of silver. It wasn't a motherlode, but it was a secret, a future Corbin had discovered. Thomas's last, gasped word had been his name. Corbin. Evie knew the truth. Corbin had murdered her husband, and he had expertly framed the Red Dog Gang for the crime. The shell casing, the tracks, it was all a stage play, and Corbin was the director. Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine was as flexible as the money Corbin paid him, had been all too willing to accept the official narrative. There was no justice to be found in Dust Devil Flats, so Evie had decided to import her own. For 3 months, she had grieved. But her grief was not a passive sorrow, it was an active, meticulous process of forging a weapon. She had gathered information. In her quiet, unobtrusive visits to town, she listened. She learned the names of Corbin's men, their routines, the extent of his operations. And she learned everything she could about the Red Dog Gang. She learned the name of their leader, Clay Rourke, a man known to be as cunning as he was ruthless. She learned of their reputation for hitting big, high-risk targets, and she learned of their rumored hideout in the treacherous maze of canyons in the Cindercone Badlands. Tonight, the performance was over. The moon was a slender, silver sickle in a black, starless sky. She traded her black morning dress for a man's riding trousers and a dark, homespun shirt. She strapped a small, serviceable Colt pistol to her hip, the gun Thomas had taught her to use but that she had never fired at a living thing. She moved with a silent, deliberate purpose that would have shocked the citizens of Dust Devil Flats. The fragile, broken widow was gone. In her place was a woman of ice and iron. She did not take the main road. She rode her sturdiest horse through the back trails, her knowledge of the local terrain absolute. She was not just a farmer's wife. She had ridden this land since she was a girl, and she knew its secrets. Her destination was the Cindercone Badlands, a place honest folk avoided, a place where a woman riding alone was either a fool or a devil. As she rode, the mask of grief fell away, revealing a face as hard and emotionless as a stone carving. The hollow look in her eyes was still there, but it was not from sorrow. It was the emptiness of a vessel that has been filled with a single, all-consuming purpose: vengeance. She was not writing to hire a gang of outlaws. She was writing to recruit a pack of wolves, to unleash them on the man who had taken her life from her. She would give them a target, a prize, and a reason. And they would never know that the grieving widow who came to them for help was a far more dangerous predator than any of them. The hunt had begun, and the first trap was about to be set. Chapter 2: A Bargain with Devils. The Cindercone Badlands were a landscape forged in hell's own furnace. Jagged spires of black, volcanic rock clawed at the sky, and the ground was a treacherous maze of narrow, winding canyons and razor-sharp scree. It was the perfect place for a pack of wolves like the Red Dog Gang to make their den. Evie found their hideout not by luck, but by meticulous research and a keen understanding of human nature. Outlaws needed water and a defensible position with a clear line of sight. She found the Placia hidden, box canyon with a single, narrow entrance and a trickle of a spring just after dawn on her second day. 2 sentries, their rifles held loosely, guarded the entrance. They watched her approach, a lone female figure, with a mixture of suspicion and a crude, leering curiosity. "That's far enough, little lady," one of them called out, his voice a low growl. "This ain't a place for you." "I'm here to see Clay Rourke," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the fear that was a cold knot in her stomach. "I have a business proposition for him." The men laughed, but there was something in her demeanor, a cold, unwavering confidence, that gave them pause. After a tense, silent standoff, one of the men shrugged and went to fetch their leader. Clay Rourke emerged from the shadows of the canyon like a panther. He was not what she had expected. He was not a grizzled, prudish thug. He was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with a lean, whipcord strength. He had a handsome, intelligent face, a steady, assessing gaze, and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He moved with a quiet, dangerous grace. She knew instantly that this was a man who was far more than a simple outlaw. He was a leader, a strategist, and he was the man she had to fool. "They tell me you're looking for me," he said, his voice a low, even baritone. "It's a long, dangerous ride for a woman alone. You either have a lot of courage, or you're a fool." "I'm a widow, Mr. Rourke," she said, meeting his gaze directly, "and I'm out of all other options." She played her part to perfection. She was Evelyn Thorne, the grieving, desperate widow. She told him the story, the one she had been rehearsing for months. She told him about her husband, about her land, and about the man who wanted it, Bartholomew Corbin. But in her version of the story, the roles were reversed. She told him that Corbin had discovered a fortune on her land, a hidden stash of gold from an old Spanish treasure, a story just plausible enough to be tantalizing. She told him that Corbin had murdered her husband to get it. And then, the masterstroke of her deception, she told him that Corbin, to cover his tracks, had framed the Red Dog Gang for the crime. "He planted the evidence," she said, her voice trembling with a perfectly feigned mixture of grief and rage. "He used your name to make himself a hero, the man who discovered the crime. He's sitting on a fortune that he stole over my husband's dead body, and he's using your reputation as his shield." She watched him, gauging his reaction. She saw the flicker of interest in his stormy eyes. She had given him more than just a target. She had given him an insult to his professional pride. "And what do you want from me, Mrs. Thorne?" he asked, his voice still carefully neutral. "I want vengeance," she said, the word tasting real and true on her tongue, even though its target was a lie. "And you want what he has. I can't get to him, but you can. I know his routines, the layout of his ranch, the schedules of his men. I can be your eyes and ears inside his world. I can guide you right to his front door. You help me destroy him, and you can have whatever is in his vault. I just want him to pay for what he did to my husband." It was a brilliant performance, a story that appealed to their greed, their pride, and their inherent hatred for powerful, corrupt men like Corbin. She was offering them a perfect, high-value target, delivered with an insider's map. One of Rourke's men, a hot-headed brute with a scarred face named Finn, spat on the ground. "It's a trap, Clay. This smells all wrong." Clay Rourke held up a hand, silencing him. He continued to study Evie, his gaze intense, searching. "You're asking us to trust the word of a woman we've never met? To risk our necks on a ghost story about Spanish gold? It's not a ghost story, she said, reaching into her saddlebag. She pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch and tossed it at his feet. It landed with a dull, metallic thud. He bent and opened it. Inside were two heavy, crudely smelted bars of pure silver. "My husband found the source," she lied, her voice steady. "This is all he was able to extract before Corbin killed him. The rest is in Corbin's vault." "That's your proof." The silver was real. It was the fruit of Thomas's discovery, the nest egg she had planned to use to start her new life. Now, it was the bait for her trap. The sight of the silver silenced all arguments. Greed was a language they all understood. Clay Rourke looked from the silver back to her face. He saw a desperate, grieving woman, driven to an alliance with devils by a monstrous injustice. He saw a valuable asset, an inside source. And he saw a fire in her eyes that mirrored his own. He made his decision. "All right, Mrs. Thorne," he said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "You've got a deal. We'll be your instrument of vengeance. Mr. Corbin is about to find out what it really means to have the Red Dog Gang on his trail." The alliance was forged. Evie had walked into the wolf's den and convinced the alpha that the sheep was his ally, and the shepherd his true enemy. As she rode with them deeper into their canyon hideout, she felt a cold, chilling sense of triumph. The pieces of her deadly game were now in motion. Chapter 3: The First Cut. Evelyn's strategy was one of slow, deliberate strangulation. A direct assault on a man like Corbin would be foolish. He was too well defended, too powerful. She had to bleed him, to dismantle his empire piece by piece, to attack his confidence and his profits until he was weak and isolated. Her vengeance would be a death by 1,000 cuts. The first cut was aimed at his wallet. Corbin's primary source of ready cash was his massive cattle operation, a herd of thousands that grazed on the land he had acquired from smaller ranchers. A large portion of this herd was currently being held in the northern pastures, being fattened for a drive to the railhead in 2 weeks' time, a sale that would net him a small fortune. "He keeps only a dozen men on the north herd," she explained to Clay and his men, gathered around a rough-hewn table in their hideout. A map she had drawn from memory spread before them. "They're spread thin, arrogant. They don't expect trouble." Her plan was not a simple cattle rustle. That was crude, and it left a trail. Her idea was more insidious. "There's a pass to the west of the pasture," she said, her finger tracing a line on the map. "They call it Devil's Jaw. It's a treacherous piece of land, full of rock slides and narrow ledges. He'd never risk taking a herd through there. If the cattle were to be spooked, in the dead of night, and driven not east towards the open plains, but west, they would scatter into the canyons. He'd spend a month trying to round up half of them. The rest would be lost. It would ruin the sale." Clay Rourke listened, a look of grudging admiration in his stormy eyes. This was not the plan of a simple, grieving widow. This was the cold, calculated thinking of a field general. "Spooking a herd of 1,000 cattle in the dark is a tricky business, Mrs. Thorne," he said. "Which is why you won't be doing it," she replied calmly. "I will." The outlaws stared at her, dumbfounded. But she explained the second part of her plan. While she created the diversion, their job was more direct. Corbin pays his men from a strong box he keeps at the main ranch house. Every Friday, a rider brings the wages up to the northern camp. The route is the same every time. She tapped a spot on the map. "He passes through a narrow arroyo here. Alone. You will take the payroll. You will be long gone before anyone even knows the cattle are spooked." It was a brilliant two-pronged attack. It was a direct financial blow, providing the gang with a small, immediate profit to keep them invested, while the larger act of sabotage would cripple Corbin's main operation. And the two events, happening miles apart, would seem unrelated, just a run of bad luck. That night, they put the plan into motion. While Clay and his men rode for the arroyo, Evie, dressed in dark clothes, made her way to the edge of the northern pasture. She moved with the silent, confident steps of a woman on her own land. She carried a bundle of oil-soaked rags and a box of matches. She waited until the dead of night, there when the night guards would be at their drowsiest. She approached the sleeping herd from the west, the direction of the Devil's Jaw. She tied the rags to the horns of a half-dozen of the led steers, then, with a steady hand, she lit them. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The steers, waking to find fire dancing on their heads, let out bellows of pure, primal terror and bolted. The panic spread through the herd like a contagion. Within seconds, 1,000 head of cattle were a thundering, unstoppable river of flesh and horns, a stampede moving with the force of an earthquake. And they were heading directly west, into the treacherous canyons, just as she had planned. The handful of cowboys were helpless, their shouts lost in the thunder of the hooves. Evie watched from a safe distance, her face illuminated by the flickering, dancing lights of the burning rags, her expression as impassive as a stone. She felt no thrill, no joy, only a cold, grim satisfaction. The first cut had been made, and it was deep. She returned to the hideout before dawn. Clay and his men were already there, a heavy wooden strongbox sitting on the table, its lock broken. They had been successful. Clay looked at her as she walked in, his face smudged with trail dust, a new respect in his eyes. "You did it," he said. It was not a question. "So did you," she replied, gesturing to the box. The men cheered, their morale soaring. They had followed the widow's plan, and it had paid off handsomely. Their trust in her was solidifying. But as Clay Rourke watched her, saw the cold, detached way she looked at their victory, a small, unsettling question began to form in his mind. The woman who had planned this, the woman who could so calmly unleash such chaos, was she really just a simple farmer's wife? Or was she something else entirely? He pushed the thought aside. For now, she was the key to the biggest score of their lives. And that was all that mattered. Chapter 4 of The Poison Water. The loss of the North Herd and the payroll sent a shockwave through Bartholomew Corbin's empire. He was a man who prided himself on control, and for the first time, things were spiraling beyond his grasp. The financial loss was significant, but the blow to his authority was more severe. His men were spooked. The story of the Phantom Stampede grew wilder with each telling, taking on a supernatural quality. Corbin, a man who believed only in the tangible power of gold and fear, did not believe in phantoms. He suspected a coordinated attack. He doubled the guards at his main ranch and sent riders out to scout the territory, but he was looking for a rival cattle baron, not a grieving widow and a gang of outlaws. Evelyn, back in the Red Dog Gang's hideout, knew that momentum was crucial. She had to strike again, quickly, before Corbin could consolidate his defenses. The second cut would not be aimed at his money, but at his most vital asset in the arid territory, water. Corbin controls the entire valley because he owns the aquifer, she explained to Clay and his men, her finger tracing the path of the Stone Creek on her hand-drawn map. Every well, every stream, is fed by it, but he has a weakness. To water his vast southern herd, he relies on a series of windmills and holding tanks. The largest, the one that serves as the main reservoir for the entire southern range, is here. She tapped a location marked Big Windmill. It's heavily guarded, Clay noted, his stormy eyes studying the map. After what happened to the North Herd, he'll have a dozen men there. They'll be guarding against an attack on the windmill itself, Evie said, a cold, calculating glint in her eye. They'll be watching for men with dynamite. They won't be watching the water. The source of the windmill's well is a small, underground spring that surfaces a half-mile up the canyon. It's an insignificant little pool, hidden in a thicket of willows. But it's the heart of his entire southern operation. Poison the heart, and the body will die. The idea was audacious and cruel. A silence fell over the outlaws. They were thieves and killers, but this was a different kind of warfare. Poison, one of the men, a young outlaw named Kid Billy, asked nervously. We'd be killing hundreds of cattle. Exactly, Evie said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. And Corbin will have to spend a fortune moving what's left of his herd to new pasture, or they'll die of thirst. It will take him weeks, and it will cost him a fortune. Clay Rourke watched her, his expression a mixture of fascination and a growing unease. The ruthlessness of her plan was both impressive and deeply unsettling. The woman he'd met a few weeks ago, the trembling, grieving widow, was nowhere to be seen. This woman was a strategist, as cold and unforgiving as the desert itself. What kind of poison? He asked, his voice a low rumble. Evie reached into her saddlebag and produced a small, burlap sack. Lockoid, she said. The ranchers call it crazyweed. It won't kill the cattle outright, not in a single drink. But it will drive them mad, make them wander off, stop eating, and eventually die. It's untraceable in the water. To Corbin's men, it will just look like a sudden, Mysterious plague has struck the herd. The plan was set. That night, Evie and Clay rode out alone, leaving the rest of the gang behind. This was a mission that required stealth, not brute force. They moved under the cover of darkness to ghosts on a deadly errand. Clay, for the first time, saw firsthand the depth of her skill in the wilderness. She moved with an unnerving silence, her senses alive to the night, her knowledge of the terrain absolute. He was the legendary outlaw, but in this moment, he felt like he was the student. They found the spring, a small, dark pool hidden in a dense thicket, just as she had described. While Clay stood guard, his rifle at the ready, Evie knelt by the water's edge. She opened the sack and emptied the bitter, dried weeds into the spring, watching as they floated for a moment before slowly sinking into the dark water, dissolving and disappearing, a silent, invisible venom. As she worked, a strange, intense intimacy formed between them in the darkness. They were partners in a dark and terrible act, a shared sin that bound them together. "You hate him," Clay said, his voice a quiet observation, not a question. "This is more than just vengeance for your husband." Evie paused, her hands in the cold water. "He didn't just take my husband, Mr. Rourke," she said, her voice low and filled with a venom that matched the weeds she was handling. "He took my future. He tried to erase me. I'm just returning the favor." When they returned to the hideout, the second cut had been made. Now, all they had to do was wait for the poison to do its work. Clay Rourke found he could not sleep. He kept seeing her face in the moonlight, her eyes as she looked at the poisoned water. He had made a bargain with a grieving widow. He was beginning to suspect he had made a pact with something far more ancient and far more dangerous. Chapter 5: A Crack in the Facade. The plague hit the southern herd 3 days later. It started with a few steers acting strangely, wandering away from the main herd, their eyes wide and unfocused. Then more, and more. Within a week, the southern range was a scene of chaos. Dozens of cattle were dead, and hundreds more were sick, their bizarre, self-destructive behavior a mystery to Corbin's terrified cowboys. They blamed the water, but they couldn't find a source. The wells seemed clean. It looked like the land itself had been cursed. Corbin was hemorrhaging money. The cost of hiring extra hands to move the surviving cattle, the loss of the stock, the blow to his reputation. It was a devastating series of cuts that was beginning to cripple his empire. He became a man besieged, his arrogance cracking, replaced by a raw, paranoid fury. He knew this was not a curse. This was an attack. He just didn't know who the enemy was. He put a bounty on the Red Dog Gang, dead or alive, but it was a shot in the dark. Evelyn, playing her part as the quiet, reclusive widow, watched his unraveling from a distance. The townsfolk whispered about Corbin's string of bad luck, some even suggesting it was a divine punishment for his greed. Her deception was working perfectly. She was an object of pity, a ghost in black, while the real ghost, the one orchestrating the chaos, was her. But a crack was forming in her own perfect facade. Her relationship with Clay Rourke was evolving into something she had not anticipated. Their shared missions, their late-night planning sessions, had forged a bond between them, a dangerous intimacy built on a foundation of lies. She found herself drawn to his sharp intelligence, his quiet confidence, and the surprising flashes of a buried honor she saw within him. He was not the brute she had expected. He was a complex, intelligent man who had chosen the outlaw life, and she found herself wanting to know why. He, in turn, was utterly fascinated by her. The fragile widow had been replaced by a brilliant, ruthless strategist, a woman of iron will and a mind as sharp as a razor. He respected her, but he also began to see the immense toll her quest for vengeance was taking. He saw the haunted look in her eyes when she thought no one was watching, the way her hands would tremble almost imperceptibly after she had outlined a particularly cold-blooded plan. One night, as they sat by the fire, he confronted her. "This is killing you, Evelyn," he said, his voice gentle. "This hate, it's a poison of its own. What happens when it's over? What happens when Corbin is destroyed?" His question hit her with the force of an unexpected blow. She had been so focused on the mechanics of her revenge, on the next step, the next cut, that she had never allowed herself to think about the after. Her future was a blank, terrifying void. The mission was all that was keeping the true, crushing weight of her grief at bay. "There is no after," she said, her voice a near whisper, the first crack in her iron control. There is only this. He reached out, his hand covering hers. It was not the gesture of a partner in crime, but of a man offering a human comfort she had not felt since Thomas's death. The touch was a spark, an unexpected warmth in the cold emptiness of her mission. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her composure fracturing. "I need to be alone," she said, her voice tight, and she retreated into the shadows of the canyon, away from his probing gaze, away from the dangerous and wanted feelings he was awakening in her. Clay watched her go, a deep sense of foreboding settling over him. He had seen that look before, in men who had gone too far over the edge, men who had let their hate consume them until there was nothing left. He had made a bargain to get a fortune in gold. He now realized he was a player in a much more dangerous game, a game for a woman's soul. And he was beginning to fear that it was a game everyone was destined to lose. Chapter 6. The Final Deception. Corbin was a cornered animal. His empire was crumbling, his men were deserting, and his mind was unraveling under the pressure of the invisible war being waged against him. In his desperation, he fixated on the one thing that had started it all, the Thorn homestead, the source of the silver. His paranoia convinced him that the answer to all his problems, the source of the attack, lay with the quiet, black-clad widow. His final act was one of brutal, direct force. He and his last few loyal men rode to her homestead in the dead of night, no longer bothering with the pretense of sympathy. They were there to take the land and tear it apart until they found the treasure he believed was hidden there. But Evelyn, in her cold, meticulous planning, had anticipated this. This was the endgame she had been preparing for all along. This was her final, master deception. She was not at the homestead. She was with Clay Rourke and his men, hidden in the rocks overlooking her own property. She had laid a trap, and Corbin was walking right into it. "He's taking the bait," she whispered to Clay, her voice a low, triumphant hiss as they watched Corbin's men dismount and storm the small, dark cabin. "What now?" Clay asked, his hand on his gun. "We have him." "Not yet," she said. "The trap isn't for him. It's for you." Clay turned to her, a look of confusion on his face. In that moment, her expression changed. The mask of the ally, the partner, fell away, and for the first time, he saw the true, terrifying face of her vengeance. Her eyes were chips of ice, her smile a chilling, predatory slash. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Rourke," she said, and raised her pistol. But she did not point it at him. She pointed it at the sky and fired a single shot. It was a signal. From the other side of the valley, a volley of rifle fire answered. Not from the Red Dog gang. From a dozen hidden positions, a posse of lawmen, led by a determined U.S. Marshal, opened fire. The scene exploded into chaos. Corbin's men, caught completely by surprise, were pinned down in the open. The Red Dog gang, equally stunned, found themselves in the middle of a massive law enforcement trap. Clay stared at her, the pieces of the puzzle finally, horrifyingly, clicking into place. The frame job on his gang, the stolen payroll, the convenient way she had led him to believe Corbin was the villain. It was all a lie. A magnificent, intricate, and deadly lie. She hadn't hired them to destroy Corbin. She had used them to lure Corbin out into the open, and she had used them both as bait for a much larger trap. "You," he breathed, a look of stunned disbelief and a strange, unwilling admiration on his face. "It was you. All of it. You framed us for your husband's murder." "My husband was a federal agent, Mr. Rourke," she said, her voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. She held up the silver locket she always wore. She opened it. Inside was not a portrait, but a small, silver badge. He was investigating Corbin's criminal network. Corbin found out and murdered him. I was the only witness. But a woman's word against a man like Corbin, it's nothing. I had no proof. So, I decided to build my own. She had sent an anonymous letter to the U.S. Marshal weeks ago, telling him that the notorious Red Dog gang, the men responsible for the murder of a federal agent, were planning a final, brazen raid on the man who had identified them, Bartholomew Corbin. She had given them the time, the place, and a promise that the entire gang would be there. She had played them all. She had used the outlaws to destroy the man who had killed her husband, and she had used the law to destroy the outlaws. Down below, the gunfight was a bloody, one-sided affair. Corbin's men and the Red Dog gang were caught in a brutal crossfire. They were being annihilated. Clay looked from the carnage below to the woman standing before him. He saw not a grieving widow. He saw a queen on a chessboard, calmly sacrificing every piece to take the king. He raised his own pistol, his face a mask of betrayal and fury. "You lied to me," he snarled. "I did," she said, her own gun still steady. "You are a thief and a killer, Mr. Rourke. You were a means to an end. Now, you have a choice. You can die here with your men, or you can get on your horse and ride, and never, ever come back." The final deception was complete. Her vengeance was absolute. She had set the world on fire, and she was the only one left standing in the ashes. Chapter 7: A Reckoning in the Dust. The homestead was a hell of smoke, muzzle flashes, and the screams of dying men. The U.S. Marshal's trap was brutally efficient. The Red Dog gang and Corbin's men, caught in a devastating crossfire, were being systematically annihilated. They were rats in a barrel, fighting each other as much as the unseen lawmen. High in the rocks, Clay Rourke stood frozen, the world tilting on its axis. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had begun to feel a dangerous connection with, was his executioner. He saw it all now with a horrifying clarity, her perfect story, the convenient evidence, the way she had masterfully played on his pride and his greed. He was a pawn, a disposable piece in her grand, bloody game. His first instinct was a surge of pure, murderous rage. He raised his pistol, the barrel leveled at her heart. "You bitch," he snarled, his voice a low, guttural sound of pure betrayal. Evelyn did not flinch. She met his gaze, her own pistol still steady, her face a mask of cold and yielding resolve. "I gave you a choice, Mr. Rourke. You can die for a lie, or you can live for a chance at something else. Your men are already dead. Your life as the leader of the Red Dog gang is over. What happens next is up to you." The sound of a ricocheting bullet whining past his head broke the spell. A stray shot from the battle below. The choice was stark: die here in a battle that was not his, for a cause that was a lie, or swallow the bitter pill of his own foolishness and survive. He looked down at the carnage. He saw his men, the men who had followed him, being cut to pieces. He saw Corbin, his supposed prize, firing wildly from the cover of the well, a cornered animal. It was all for nothing. All for a widow's magnificent, terrible lie. With a curse that was ripped from the very depths of his soul, he lowered his gun. "This isn't over, Evelyn," he hissed. "Yes," she said, her voice devoid of triumph. "It is." She watched as he melted back into the rocks, a ghost disappearing into the chaos, his escape covered by the thunder of the gunfight. She had won. She had broken him, had taken his gang, his pride, and his purpose. She then turned her attention to the real target. Down below, Bartholomew Corbin was making a desperate last stand. He had taken cover behind the stone wall of the well, very spot where he had murdered her husband. The poetic justice was almost too perfect. The marshal's men were closing in, but Corbin was a formidable fighter, his shots keeping them at bay. Evelyn would not let him be taken by the law. This final act was hers, and hers alone. She began her descent, moving with the practiced silence she had honed over the past months, circling around the battle to approach the homestead from the rear, using the burning cabin as cover. She slipped into the smoke-filled barn, her heart a cold, steady drum. She found what she was looking for, the old, heavy buffalo rifle Thomas had kept mounted on the wall, a relic from his father. She checked the load. It was ready. She climbed to the hayloft, the smoke burning her lungs. Through a gap in the wooden slats, she had a clear, unobstructed view of the well. Of Corbin. He was reloading, his back to her, his attention focused on the lawmen in front of him. This was the moment she had lived for, the moment she had sacrificed her soul for. She rested the heavy barrel of the rifle on the ledge, took a deep, steadying breath, and looked down the long iron sights. The world narrowed to the man who had destroyed her life. She saw not a cattle king, but a murderer. She remembered Thomas's last, gasped breath. She squeezed the trigger. The buffalo rifle's roar was a deafening, biblical sound that momentarily silenced the entire battlefield. Down by the well, Corbin's body was thrown forward as if by an invisible hand. He collapsed over the stone wall, half in, half out, his reign of terror ending in the very spot it began. Silence fell over the valley. The last of the outlaws threw down their guns. It was over. Evelyn stood in the hayloft, enveloped in smoke, the heavy rifle in her hand, her face a blank, emotionless mask. Vengeance was a hollow, empty thing. It had not brought back her husband. It had only turned her into a monster worthy of his killer. Chapter 8. The Price of a Ghost. U.S. Marshal John Garrett was a man who believed in a simple, orderly world. There were good men and there were bad men, and his job was to put the bad men in the ground or in a cage. The scene at the Thorne homestead was a satisfying, if bloody, victory. The notorious Red Dog Gang was annihilated. The corrupt tyrant of Dust Devil Flats, Bartholomew Corbin, was dead. And it was all thanks to the courage and assistance of a brave, grieving widow. He found Evelyn as she walked out of the smoking barn, her face smudged with soot, the big rifle held loosely in her hand. He saw her not as a schemer, but as a victim who had been forced to fight back. His admiration for her was immense. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice filled with a respectful gravitas, "you have done a great service to this territory. You not only helped us bring a murderer to justice, but you've ended the reign of the Red Dog Gang for good. You are a hero." Evelyn looked at him, at his honest and suspecting face, and the full weight of her deception settled upon her. She was not a hero. She was a manipulator, a liar who had used his good intentions and the lives of dozens of men outlaws and lawmen to lick his pieces in her private game. "I did what I had to do, Marshal," she said, her voice a hollow echo of the truth. The lie was complete. Her performance had been flawless. In the official report, she would be immortalized as the brave widow who had worked with the law to avenge her husband, a federal agent killed in the line of duty. The story of the Spanish silver would be the accepted motive for the gang's presence, a convenient fiction that explained everything. The town of Dust Devil Flats, liberated from its oppressor, celebrated her. They saw her as their savior, their Joan of Arc in black. But in the quiet of her ruined homestead, the adulation was a torment. She had won. Corbin was dead. His empire was being dismantled by the federal government. But she was a ghost in her own life, haunted not by her husband's death, but by the actions she had taken in his name. The nights were the worst. She would see the faces of the men who had died, the outlaws she had led to their deaths, the young lawmen who had been caught in the crossfire. She saw Clay Rourke's face, the look of profound betrayal in his stormy eyes. She had sought vengeance, believing it would be a cleansing fire. But the fire had consumed her as well, burning away the woman she had been, leaving behind a creature of cold, hard ash. The town's pity had been replaced by their admiration, but both felt equally false, equally isolating. She was more alone now than she had been in the depths of her feigned grief. She was a hero to the world, but in the silent judgment of her own heart, she was a villain. Chapter 9. The Devil's Return. A month passed. The town began to heal. A new sheriff, appointed by the marshal, brought a sense of real law and order to Dust Devil Flats for the first time. The ruins of Evelyn's homestead were a grim reminder of the battle, but she made no move to rebuild. She lived in a small room at the boarding house, a recluse in a town that revered her, the weight of her secret a physical burden that bent her shoulders and stole the light from her eyes. She thought she was free. She thought the ghosts of her past were buried. She was wrong. One night, there was a quiet knock on her door. Not the polite knock of a neighbor. A sound she recognized. She opened the door, and her heart stopped. Leaning against the doorframe, a ghost returned from a battle she thought he had lost, was Clay Rourke. He was thinner, his face harder, and there was a new, cold emptiness in his stormy eyes. But he was alive. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "I believe you and I have some unfinished business." She did not reach for a gun. She knew it would be useless. She simply stood aside and let him in. The devil had returned to collect his due. "How?" she whispered. "I'm hard to kill," he said, moving into the center of her small room, his presence filling it, sucking the air out. "I slipped away in the chaos. Watched from the hills. I saw your final shot. I saw the marshal hail you as a hero. It was a beautiful performance. Truly. One for the ages." There was no heat in his voice. No rage. Only a chilling, dead calm that was far more terrifying. "What do you want?" she asked. "Want?" he chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "That's a good question. My men are dead. My name is mud in every territory from here to the border. And it's all because I was foolish enough to trust a grieving widow. He took a step closer. You took everything from me, Evelyn. My crew, my future, my trust. That's a debt, and I'm here to collect. She braced herself for the killing blow. She had lived with the expectation of this moment for a month. In a way, it was a relief. But he didn't draw a gun. He simply looked at her, his eyes searching her face. I could kill you, he said, his voice a near whisper. And for a long time, that's all I thought about. But it's too easy. Too quick. You built a prison of lies for me. I think it's only fair I return the favor. He told her his plan. He was not going to expose her. He was not going to kill her. He was going to become her shadow. You're a hero now, Evelyn, he sneered. A pillar of this pathetic little town. You're going to stay that way. You're going to live out your long, respectable life. And I'm going to be there, in the background, to remind you of what you really are. Every time you see a stranger in the street, you'll wonder if it's me. Every time a floorboard creaks at night, you'll think of me. I'm not going to be your executioner. I'm going to be your conscience. It was a punishment far more cruel, far more insidious, than a bullet. He was sentencing her to a lifetime of fear, a prison of her own making, with him as the permanent warden. Chapter 10, The Widow's Penance. Clay Rourke was true to his word. He did not harm her. He simply stayed. He took a job as a hostler at the livery stable, a quiet, brooding man with a past no one asked about. He became a fixture in the town, a constant, silent presence at the edge of Evelyn's life. Her life became a new kind of hell. She was a celebrated hero, forced to wear a mask of humble grace, while every day she saw the man who knew the monstrous truth. He never spoke to her in public, but their eyes would meet across the dusty street, and in his cold, stormy gaze, she saw her own damnation reflected back at her. The admiration of the townspeople turned to ash in her mouth. The peace that had been restored to the valley was a peace she could never share. She was a ghost, haunted by a living man. Months turned into a year. The dynamic between them was a silent, agonizing war of attrition. But something strange began to happen. She saw him not just as her tormentor, but as a man. She saw him gentle as a spooked horse. She saw him give a coin to a beggar child. She saw the profound, crushing loneliness in him, a mirror of her own. He was as much a prisoner of her vengeance as she was. The turning point came during a harsh winter. A fever swept through the town, and Evelyn, reverting to her true calling, worked tirelessly at her father's side, tending to the sick. She worked until she collapsed from exhaustion, the fever taking her as well. She awoke in her own bed, weak and disoriented. The room was dark, save for a single lantern. A figure was sitting in a chair by her bed, bathing her forehead with a cool cloth. It was Clay. He had not left. He had stayed, and when she had fallen ill, he had been the one to nurse her, to sit by her side through the long, feverish nights, just as she had once imagined doing for him. Why, she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. I don't know, he said, his voice rough with an emotion she had never heard from him. He looked at her, and the coldness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. Maybe I realized that watching you suffer wasn't a victory. It was just more ashes. Maybe I was tired of the ghosts. In that quiet, lamplit room, the war between them ended. The hate, the betrayal, the need for vengeance seed all burned away, leaving behind only two broken, lonely people who understood each other in a way no one else ever could. They were not a hero and a villain. They were just survivors, bound together by a shared, bloody past. His torment had become her penance. Her prison had become his. And in their shared exile, they found not forgiveness, but a kind of quiet, bitter understanding. They would never escape the ghosts of what she had done, but they would no longer have to face them alone. The widow's vengeance had ended, and in its place, a long, difficult, and uncertain penance had just begun.